Okay, welcome everyone. So this is going to be class 2 and our first session of class 2. So with class 2, what I want to focus on primarily is tracking and stabilizing. So it's going to be broken up into two different sessions. So session 1, which is this one, I'm going to be looking at using the warp stabilizer to stabilize shaky footage. Also going to be looking at how to use tracking to stabilize footage, and then how do you track a null object onto moving footage and then add a graphic to that. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the first session. So the first thing that I want to do is obviously be opening up a new After Effects project, and I'm going to import a piece of footage to look at. So this is what the footage looks like. I'm going to drag it directly into my workspace timeline, and if I play the footage, I want you to just take notes of how sort of shaky it is. A good way to take note of that is to look at this bottom table edge. So that's completely straight, the table cannot be wonky, but you can see exactly how it's moving with regards to the actual camera movement. So it's not completely straight, there's a little bit of shakiness movement. You can see it over here with the plant, it's the camera movement is moving up and down. So the idea with this now is to try and stabilize it so that the table and everything that's in regards to this table, so this woman, her laptop, and the plant is pretty much stable, so it's easier to look at. It doesn't feel like it's filmed on a hand cam. It feels like the camera is standing on a tripod. So how are we going to do that? First method, so we're going to be looking at warp stabilizing with tracking, and tracking in general to add a graphic. So what I want you to do first is just to rename this to be our base footage. So we can compare it later on. And I want you to duplicate this an additional 3 times, because we want to keep our base footage, and then we're going to have 3 examples. So I'm just going to Control D 3 more times. So in total there's going to be 4 layers of this footage. So the first layer that we're going to work on over here, we're going to just rename that to warp stabilize. Again, apologies for my spelling. Yeah, and then the next one we're going to go for is tracking stabilize, and the last one we're going to do is track graphic. Okay, so for now we're going to just be working with the warp stabilize. So just to make things a little bit more clearer, what I'm going to do is just change the color of each of these different tracking and stabilizing activities, so you can just know which one we're working with. Go purple, and the last one yellow. Actually change these 2 colors just so that they don't really get mixed up. Purple. Okay, so I'm going to just toggle the visibility of the tracking of the graphic, the tracking stabilizer, and the base footage. So I only want to be working with the warp stabilize now, and you can tell I'm working with the warp stabilize. I gave it the layer color of yellow, and when I select this layer, then there are yellow vertices and markings around the actual footage within the composition. So with the warp stabilizer, it's quite easy. All you need to do is select your footage. Over here on the right hand side panel, we're going to go to effects and presets, and I'm going to type in warp, and there's quite a few options, but if you just press the space bar, then you can see that warp stabilizer over here is under distort, and all we need to do is just click and drag it over and apply it to the footage, and it's already going to start running. So obviously what you can do is you can cancel it. You can start playing with a whole bunch of these different settings in your results, but generally it's quite effective if you just drag and drop it on. Now this is going to be determined, the success rate of stabilizing using the warp stabilizer is going to be determined by how shaky your initial footage is. If your footage is extremely shaky, you're going to have a really weird and unwanted result, whereas if it's something like this where it's very minimal and you want to make small adjustments, that can be done quite easily and quite well. So you can see over here on the top left hand side corner, it's currently busy analyzing the footage, and I'll explain what it's actually doing. But it's currently on 15%, it's going to take more or less about 3 minutes to get done, and it's on frame 75 of 420. So what it's currently doing over here, if you can look by the framing, there are 3 things that After Effects is currently running in the background to apply to this footage. It's looking to stabilize the footage, then it's going to crop it, and it's going to auto scale it. So what is essentially going on here, and this is going to make more sense once we get into the tracking stabilizing and the tracking of the graphic, where it's more of a manual sort of process, not entirely. It can be done manually, but we're not going to go that route. So what it's essentially doing is that it's trying to find high points of contrast in order to fixate a specific sort of function onto it. Usually if you had to do this manually, you would track a specific point of footage that has high contrast. So a good example of that would be the ports on the MacBook. The ports are completely black in comparison to the MacBook, which is quite silver and white, so it's a nice point of high contrast, because After Effects is using the luminance values to try and differentiate between pixels of light and dark to track and fixate an object or function onto that. So it is essentially applying this sort of information and attaching it to something visual, like a null object, which is just a blank canvas that holds a function. And from there you can scale accordingly and you can crop the footage. So what's going to happen, and you won't see it with the warp stabilizer, but you'll see it with the tracking stabilizer, is that the entire piece of footage is going to be moving up, down, left and right of the composition in order to stabilize it. So to fix that, you're going to have to scale the footage up, zooming in almost, to sort of block out these borders that are going to be created. Now again, you're not going to necessarily notice this directly with the warp stabilizer, but with the tracking stabilizer you definitely will, and it will make a bit more sense. So right now, the warp stabilizer, everything gets done for you, everything gets done in the background and it gets applied. The tracking stabilizer, you have more control. It's a little bit more of a manual process, and if mistakes do occur, you can fix them, and it's just going to make a little bit more sense with regards to what the warp stabilizer is essentially doing for you. Yeah, and from here, after this, in session 2, we're going to be looking at 3D tracking and how you can track something like drone footage or footage of someone walking through a forest or anything like that. You can 3D track it, again attach a null object to it, and you can parent a graphic or text or shape layer to that null object, and your graphic will then live within a virtual 3D space inside of After Effects, creating the illusion of distance and perception when you play it through. So that's quite interesting. Okay, so right now it's just finished analyzing and it's busy stabilizing the footage itself, and now it's finished. So once that orange bar goes away, your footage should now be quite stable. So I'm going to play through it, and this is a good opportunity to show you in real time what I was speaking about with regards to the info and this rendering green bar. So if I play the footage now, I want you to just take note that it's running quite slowly, and you'll see this red line of text appear, and it's telling you that currently it's at 8 frames out of your 25 frames that you require to view this, and it's telling you that it's not real time. So this is very important. So I don't want you to think that while you're watching this play through that you applied some sort of an effect, or the warp stabilizer didn't work and now your footage is completely laggy. That's not the case. It's just trying to render through as much as it can to give you a real-time playback, and while it's doing that, it can't present your visuals and your video in real time for you yet. So once everything has gone through, I'm going to play it again. So now you can see that we are currently running at 25 frames per second, which is real time, and the footage seems to be a little bit more stable than the initial base footage. So just to give you an example, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to toggle the different layers on and off. So I made the base layer footage visible, and I'm just going to toggle the visibility of the warp stabilized layer. So now it's off. So the first thing you can notice when I put it back on, so whenever these little yellow cursors appear, then that's when the visibility of the warp stabilized footage is now on. So the first thing you can notice is the footage is zoomed in, not an excessive amount, but a decent amount, enough so that it blocks out the cropped frame. So it's trying to crop your footage because the actual piece of footage is moving in and out of frame to try and stabilize it as much as possible. And the next thing is that yes, it is still slightly shaky, but definitely not as bad. So this is the warp stabilized footage now playing. Definitely not as bad as the base footage. So just again notice the table, the straight line of the table almost being parallel to the bottom border of your composition. And if I take the warp stabilize off, just to give you an example, notice the table and the complete difference is with the table and the bottom half of your composition. So there's much more movement, it's much more unstable in comparison to what the warp stabilizer did. Not extremely perfect, but it is a start, and it's a process that you don't have too much control over. So what we're going to be looking at now is the tracking stabilizer. So that's warp stabilizing, completely finished. It's just an effect that you drop on, you let After Effects do its thing, and once it's done, then you're pretty much sorted. So now with regards to tracking and stabilizing, so this is a different manner of tracking and stabilizing in comparison to the warp stabilizer. So here on your right hand column there should be a tracker option. If it is not there, you'll find it under the animation tab over here on the top left hand side, and you have your options of track camera, which can be found over here, track camera, warp stabilizer effect, which is what we just used, and track motions over here. So what we're looking at for the purpose of stabilizing through tracking is we want to look at the stabilize motion aspect of the tracker over here on the right hand side. So if I click the stabilize motion, what it does is it enters into the individual layer itself. So over here on top, if I toggle through these two different tabs, your first tab is the composition that we're working in, it's over here, and once I clicked stabilize motion, it then enters into the layer which we titled tracking stabilize. So we're working on the video layer at this point. You can notice as well we now get this track point 1, and there's a large square, an inner square, and there's a crosshair. So what we want to do is you just want to drag it around and find an area that has the most contrast that we can try and track a point to. So something like this would be very great and very ideal because of the contrast surrounding this black aux port. If you go for something like this, yes, there's a lot of contrast, but also the dark area extends quite a bit, so you might find that the stabilized motion tracker will track very well in regards to horizontal tracking, but vertical tracking it might go a little bit haywire, moving up and down this base or stem of the plant. So what I found to be quite helpful is this dark area here of the bookmark of, I'm assuming, a Bible or book. So this bookmark provides quite great contrast, and it's very isolated contrast in comparison to something that has other dark areas around it, which could lead to mistakes that we need to fix later on. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit and drag this point over. And you can see as it does this, if you're not zoomed in close enough, it sort of magnifies your little selection over here, which pixel you want to select. So I want it to be more or less around about there. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, and I'm going to place my cursor inside the smaller square and just click and drag and try and find a nice spot for it to be in. So what's happening now is the first square over here, you can resize it. I wouldn't make it too small, so this is sort of where After Effects will be looking for this amount of pixels, and for some reason if it goes outside of the small square, then your larger square is your search area. So the larger you make this, the more time it's going to take for After Effects to search and analyze the footage to apply the different types of tracking data. So you want to keep everything more or less in proportion to each other. So we're looking for something like this with regards to a tracking frame, and from here over here on the right hand side, then all we want to do now is over here by analyze, there's a analyze backwards, analyze forwards, analyze one frame forward and one frame backwards. So this is quite nice and unique, because what you can do now is if you say analyze one frame forward, then you can see what After Effects is actually doing. So each frame, it's picking up this group of pixels in relation to our tracking point, and it's making keyframes for us. And this is also very useful because, for example, now if I have to go one frame forward and it's completely off, I can always click and drag and move it to where I want it to be, so I can track it as accurately as possible. I have more control over how I'm going to track the footage and how I'm going to stabilize the footage. So if you feel quite comfortable and quite confident that the area of contrast which you selected is sufficient and it will work quite well, then if you go over here to the Analyze Forward Play button, then you can see After Effects is running this sort of in the background. You can see it kind of goes off track slightly, and if you ever become unsure of this, you can always just pause, press the stop button, zoom in and readjust it so that it moves more towards the darker contrasty areas. Some more roundabout here. We can even move backwards, so that way I'm just readjusting. So I'm analyzing one frame backwards over here, and the purpose for this is because I noticed that the target area was slightly off. So I just want to try and make this as accurate as possible. So by moving one frame backwards, you can already see that it makes quite a big difference with regards to reanalyzing and retracking your footage. So we can just press play again, and we can sort of stay in the zoom motion just to make sure that our target is fixated on that high contrast area. You can see over here we're currently at 10 seconds out of the total 16, and we're just going to let it run now and do its whole thing. The keyframes have disappeared, and they haven't gone away forever. They still exist. They're just not visible. So once everything's stopped and finished, then you can sort of see exactly the path that this area of dark pixels moved during the entire 16 seconds of this clip. And that's how shaky this footage was, is that this wasn't centered at all. This is the path that it sort of went through based off the camera movement, and it's quite something to see in a format like this, in opposed to just applying a warp stabilizer. So now we've selected stabilized motion, we got the tracking point, we've analyzed, we've stabilized it. So now all we need to do is click apply. I'm going to get this tracking option over here, apply dimensions, X and Y. So we're only working with X and Y. This footage is not 3D. Otherwise there would be a Z depth as well. So just with the X and Y, we're going to click OK. And now this makes it quite clear as to what is actually happening. So I'm just going to let this play through, and you can see all the keyframes that After Effects generated through that stabilized motion. And I want you to just notice over here on the edges the black border. So the black is going to be the background. So what's happening is After Effects has now stabilized this footage according to this point of contrast, and is now adjusting the position of the footage up, down, left and right to keep this in the center. So this was our tracked point. So you can see how much movement there actually is, and that's the reasoning why the warp stabilized footage was slightly zoomed in comparison to the base footage, because we have to do that now to ensure that we don't end up with the final product that has these black borders, as the footage is now being moved in and out of frame. So with regards to scaling in, all we can do is we just go again under the tracking stabilized footage layer that we're working in over here, that was just stabilized. We're just going to play with the scale. So to adjust the scale, we might just move it a little bit up. That might be too much. Let's just try 102. 102 is too little. You can still see some black over there, some black border. I'm going to go 103. 103 just cuts it. It might not be enough. We're going to stick with 105, so there's some wiggle room for the footage. You can see exactly how it's moving now. And the goal with the scale function now is to just ensure that you keep the footage within the composition frame. It doesn't move around too much, and you don't get those black borders. So right over there, we're cutting it quite close over here at the bottom, but still fine, still in frame. Same thing on top, still in frame. Nothing is moving out or moving out of place. So this is essentially what we're looking for and what we're trying to achieve. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to let this render through and sort of show you a comparison between the tracking stabilized motion and the warp stabilizer. And just from now, just by looking at this right now, I can already see that there's almost minimal movement on this table completely, because me as the user, as the designer, had the ability to adjust and select which point I wanted to track from. And I selected an object that was on the table because my focus is to stabilize the footage based on this table line. So if I move my track stabilize and we look at the warp stabilizer, you can see that there's already quite a vast difference. So just from this frame over here, you can already see this is what it looks like when you stabilize motion with a tracker, when you stabilize motion with the warp stabilizer, and the actual base footage. So yes, it is zoomed in quite a bit, but it's way more stable and it's achieved what we were looking for. See, minimal movement. The bottom line of the table is almost completely parallel to the bottom part of the composition. Minimal movement, it almost seems like the camera is sitting on a tripod, and it's quite a significant difference if you compare it to the base footage where there's quite a lot of movement. Okay, so that is how you do the warp stabilizer, how you stabilize using tracking, stabilize motion using tracking. And what we're going to look at now is to track a graphic. So I'm going to do it on the base footage and just track a graphic onto that, because if you have stabilized footage and you track a graphic, you can almost just place the graphic without attaching it to a null object that has your tracking data, because the footage is going to be completely still. So it will be quite interesting to apply it to the unstable footage. So it's pretty much the same principle applies with regards to stabilized motion, except now we're going to track the motion. So we're just tracking now. So again, I just selected track motion. We're now in the track graphic video layer, and same situation applies now. You get your tracking point and you can manipulate it and move it around to wherever you want to go. So I think for this, what I want to do is I want to try something a bit different. Maybe we track maybe we try and track a section of the watch, which is going to be quite difficult, but that could be quite interesting. There's quite a dark area there. It does go away, but let's see what sort of happens. So again, I'm leaving this quite raw because I want to show you what will happen, how you can fix it, how you can adjust it. The purpose of this is not to be a polished type of a tutorial, because you might encounter problems and I want to try and address them ahead of time before you encounter them. Okay, so that's selected, and I just want to go analyze. I want to say analyze one frame forward just to see how everything is moving. That's great, that's fine, that's working great. It's attaching itself to the points, that's perfectly fine. So I'm doing this frame by frame and not just letting it analyze by itself, because I'm quite worried that something like this happens where I'm gonna have to readjust. So if I actually just let it play, there will be a lot of adjustments that I would need to make, because I'm uncertain of the movement and of the contrast values that I'm going to get with the moving watch. So I knew with the bookmark in the book that it was quite stable. It would be easy to track. So now that's still fine, that's okay, as long as we're still on that sort of bottom portion of the watch face. I'm still okay with that. It's still fine. I'm also assuming now to myself that the biggest worry with regards to this tracking of the watch is going to be now, as this woman is opening up her MacBook, as well as moving her hand away from the MacBook once it's open. Other than that, I think there's very minimal movement. So as long as this first portion is done quite properly, it it should be fine. So again, just making sure it sticks to, see over there, move more to the top of the watch face. I want to go more to the bottom. And now we're completely off track. So if this ever happens, and you can always just select it, move it to where you want it to be, again off track again, because notice the quality of the footage is not absolutely amazing, as well as there's a lot of motion blur with her moving her arm. So this is more of a manual sort of tracking exercise, and the same principles apply when you track to stabilize motion. Exact same principles apply, so you can always just go in and manually do it yourself. It will take a little bit longer, but you'll get your desired effect. So again, it just depends on which piece of footage you're using, what you're essentially tracking, and what's your goal for this tracking. So as soon as her hand comes back down, I'm not going to worry too much about the tracking, because then it should be in a more stable sort of position. So right there, that's fine. Still on the watch, no problem. That's fine, that's fine, that's fine. So again, to move my screen, I'm just holding space, left clicking with my mouse, and then just moving around the screen. Okay. That's fine, that's fine, that's fine. Okay, so now we're more or less in a territory where everything seems okay, so I'm just gonna let it analyze by itself. It will take longer because the piece of footage that we're trying to track is rather blurry, it's not in focus, and it's trying to pick up as much of the contrast levels as possible. So when it gets to about 4 seconds, I'm going to stop it. Around about 4 seconds ish. It should still be fine. Okay. So we have now tracked the watch movement, and this is the tracked watch movement. So what we're going to do now is, if you want to track a graphic, so for the graphic we tracked motion, not stabilized motion. I want to create a null object. So I'm going to create a null object. You won't see it now because we're not in the composition layer, we're in the video layer track graphic, but my null object does exist, it's over here. And the purpose for me creating the null object is because I need all this tracked data to be applied to something that I can add my graphic to, and a null object provides a perfect platform for that. So what I want to do now is I want to go to edit target, and I'm going to choose my null object. So I want my null object to be the target that all this track data gets placed onto. Once I've selected that, you can see motion target is null 1. There's my null 1 layer I just created, and I'm going to say apply. Again, this is not a 3D workspace, it's a 2D workspace, so we're just working with the X and Y dimensions. And I'm going to say apply. And not much has happened, but if you can see this little red square is my null object. And now all the data that has been tracked has been applied to this null object. So right now, if I have to go through, I'm going to just click on the track data over here, so you can see the movement. So this little red dotted outline is my null object, and it's completely attached to her watch. And from here I can attach any sort of graphic that I want to attach. For now, what I want to do is I just want to create some text and apply it that way. So I'm going to just go layer, new text layer, and I'm going to type just watch. Watch. Okay, so this is my text layer that I just created. It says watch, and what I want to do, just want to make sure that the anchor point is in the middle somewhere, and I want to move it to where I want the position to start. So I want it to be right above the watch, so around about here. Obviously it's going to change as she moves her hand and moves her when she moves her hand around to open up the laptop and bring it back, but this is where I want the word watch to be. So the word watch has no keyframes attached to it now, but the null object has all these keyframes applied to it. So all I need to do now, what I explained in the recap After Effects video, is parenting. more or less parenting, when I parented the sphere, the rectangle to the circle, so that they can have the same sort of movement without copying over keyframes. So with parenting, I'm just going to go to the watch layer, and I want to parent it to the null. So I'm going to attach the watch layer to the null object. So I just went to the drop down over here by the watch, under parent, and I selected null object 1. So now as I move through, the word watch should be attached to her watch. Okay, so now we've just successfully tracked a graphic up to the 4-second mark onto an object moving inside of a piece of footage. So this is quite useful, especially if you think about adding like information or like pop-up text, anything along those lines, maybe a HUD design, or you have a virtual watch or something along those lines. This is quite useful even for tracking logos or other smaller pieces of footage, or if you create sort of out of interest, like an explosion or something, and you green screen that, key it out, and you can attach it to her arm or anything along those lines. I know that's far-fetched, but it's just examples of what you can do with attaching things to tracked null objects. Okay, so this is we've covered warp stabilizing, stabilize with tracking. You can track a graphic and attach the tracked information to the null and apply a graphic or text to that. So that's how you stabilize footage inside of After Effects. So just experiment a bit with that, see which one works best for you, which one's the most time efficient, and which one allows you the more creative freedom and more control. Yep, so that's stabilizing. I'll see you in session 2. Peace.